So we're doing this series of trusting God in troubled times through the book of Habakkuk. We have worked our way through the first two chapters, and here we are in this final chapter that has this awesome ending that I have titled this as From Fear to Joy. And one of the favorite Pixar animated movies that we love watching again and again, though it's been for a long time, is the movie Cars and Lightning McQueen. You know, Lightning McQueen is, even now, whenever our kids see Lightning McQueen's car, they need that. It needs to be in our home. You know, he is this champion and very proud of himself, winning all those races, crushing all the competition. And then, lo and behold, through a bizarre series of events, finds himself stranded in the desert of Radiator Springs. He thinks he should not be there. He believes that that's not the place for him, but there is no way for him to escape that. And despite trying so hard, he ends up staying there, and something happens to him. He learns a lot of different life lessons in those times, to the point that he is now able to appreciate friendships, be humble, and towards the end, even when he loses the championship, he relishes his friendships. I know it's a very simple, animistic movie, and we've all enjoyed it in the past, and every time it comes on, kids still love watching it. But when that happens in real life, when we are hit with troubles, when we are hit with suffering, when we are hit with things that we are unable to handle or we never expected, our life seems to come to a grinding halt, isn't it? And the big question that looms at that time is, how do we trust God in times of trouble? And we saw the first chapter with the questions that everyone asks: how long, Lord? And why me? And why now? And we worked our way through the answers to that. And last week, we looked at three key principles that we can learn from all the woes that God speaks to the different nations. And here, in this final chapter, the prophet ends it with a beautiful prayer. You know, he's been asking God those questions. God has responded, and now it's ending with prayer. You know, the main problem when we have trials, or when we go through something painful, or when we suffer, is a deep foundational question. And the question, and the reason why we have all the questions that we ask, and why we are unable to find God or trust God, is because we don't know for sure, and we are unable to believe how this pain that we are going through, this suffering that we are going through, can bring anything good out of it. And even taking it a step beyond, when we say that, oh, God has actually allowed that or let that into our life, we are unable to trust God's plan in and through the suffering for us, and it will bring us any good. Though we may mentally understand it, it is impossible sometimes for us to feel that this thing is going to do anything good. And so what we end up doing usually, and I do this, and I'm sure all of us, is our default response is to tend to put our faith in our own efforts to go fix it, rather than to be still and trust and let God do his work. And that's the main challenge. The emphasis and the big question Habakkuk throws to all of us is, where is your faith on when you go through troubled times? Is your faith in yourself, or is your faith in your faith, or is your faith going to be in God and his plan for allowing this in your life? This is a beautiful prayer. It's one of the exemplary prayers, and very rare do we have prophetic prayers like this in the Bible, and this is one of them. And 3 times in this prayer, he uses the word Selah, which means he's taking a pause. He's just processing. God's showing him something huge in his prayerful moments, and it's affecting him deeply. And it's a prayer that has an awesome progression. It starts with fear, and it ends with joy. And that's what we are going to look at. There are 3 things I want to walk us through as we work our way through this text. First is crippling fear. By that I don't mean that fear is crippling, but how can we cripple the fear that sometimes seems to cripple us? And secondly, we are going to talk about glorious God, which what God shows Habakkuk when he prays, and something you and I can expect to happen when we pray. And finally, we are going to look at what triumphant faith looks like. Crippling fear, glorious God, triumphant faith. Crippling fear. Now, if we read in verse 2, it says, "O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear." You know, the word fear and trembling comes repeatedly 3 to 4 times in this whole book. You know, the first thing that comes to us when we are hit with something big that we are unable to manage, whether it is a sickness or the death of a loved one or a loss of a job or some relational crisis, is we are crippled with fear. But here, this is something even more of a bigger magnitude. Now, God is showing to the prophet Habakkuk what he is going to do to the nation of Israel. And not just that, he's showing something even more bigger. We are going to look at that from the past and the present and the future. And it produces a sort of a reverential fear, or it's more a sense of awe that it creates an aspect of worship for him. And in fact, he's going to see how God is telling him about the immediate destruction that's going to come upon Israel. He's going to get some glimpses of what's happened in the past and end times, and even more, and that produces this. And so he has 3 requests in his opening prayer. And the requests are coming from this text that is before us. It says, "In the midst of the years, revive it," verse 2, second part. "In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy." Now, Hebrew is sometimes very difficult to translate into contemporary English, because if you look at it, the subject of it is a little ambiguous here. It's not requiring, what is this it that the prophet is praying for and asking? It's not the it about the work that God's going to do. If you have to translate it, some Hebrew scholars have done an awesome job, and this is how they do it. They say, "Yahweh, I have heard your report. I have feared. Yahweh, your work in the midst of the years, make him live. In the midst of the years, make him understand. In the time of trembling, remember mercy." You know, the it is referring to a person who is going to hear this news and who is going to go through this, whatever God is saying is going to happen in this coming years. And so what Habakkuk prays for is, and the midst of the years is a phrase John Calvin thinks is a phrase that refers to the time between the exile that the nation of Israel is going to and the time of the coming of Christ now and in the end times. So the Habakkuk is praying sort of as a mediatorial prayer for this people of Israel, that God will do these things for the people who are going to go through this pain and suffering. First of all, he prays, "Oh God, please let them live. Do not destroy them. Do not consume them entirely." And that's our prayer too, isn't it? our initial default response when I have shared my story with you before, and I was diagnosed several years ago with Hodgkin's, the first thought that came to my mind, my very first prayer was this: God, I don't want to die. Because the oncologist said if it was type A, you have 2 years, and type B, you have 5 years. I want to live. Let me live. And that's the crisis prayer that we all have, and Habakkuk is not praying for himself. He's just praying for everyone. That we will not be consumed by this crisis, and it's totally okay to pray that prayer. And secondly, he prays for, in the midst of the years, make him understand. For understanding, I don't get this, God. It's hard to go through pain and suffering when I don't understand what's going on. We saw last week how when we go through pain and suffering, it does two things. It distorts our view and perception of reality, and it distorts our perception of God. So he prays, God, help me understand what's going on. It's hard to be in darkness of whatever you're doing and go through this. And that's an awesome prayer. And third, though it's translated wrath, he talks about in times of trembling or in such challenging times, give me mercy. Show me mercy when this fear grips me and I get agitated and I'm anxious. I don't know where to turn. No one else can help me, Lord. I need your mercy. We need all these three, isn't it? And that's how you cripple fear. You don't have to let the fear get the better of you. There is help. We don't have to stay in fear and remain in fear. We can go to God in prayer and plead with him for these things, and it will help address our fears. Because when God assures us that you will not be consumed by this, you will get through this, you will come out of this stronger, you will come out of this as way better than how you went into it. And as he gives you some perspective about your life and about him and what's going on in this world, we are going to see that. And when he gives you mercy, you will be able to overcome fear, and we do not have to live in fear. Next, as he prays, God shows him something which is the sum and essence of what is going to primarily take this fear away from him and translate the fear into faith. He starts to give him a glimpse of his glory. You know, the word glory in Hebrew comes from the word kavod, which means weightiness. You know, glory is not a word we use in contemporary times. We don't say someone when they are dressed up great that you're glorious, isn't it? But glory is what gives you or makes you someone who is substantial, who is weighty. And what makes God glorious, what makes him weighty, is his attributes, his majesty, his power, his love, his grace, and his mercy. So God gives him a vision of his glorious acts in human history and his glorious acts in the person of Christ. Verse 3 says, God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. And he pauses there. He pauses there. Before we go into these two terms, the two places that he refers to, what is very helpful to know is help is coming when you pray. When we go through a crisis, when we need help, you need to know that the person who is going to help you has the power to help you and the ability to help you and the assurance that he can actually help you out of this crisis. And that is what God is revealing to Habakkuk. He's revealing to him, help is coming, and the person who's going to help you is me, and I am this glorious God. Look at that second part of that verse. It says, his splendor covered the heavens and the earth was full of his praise. He's going to throw a lot of imageries right after this. Help is coming, Habakkuk. And let me point you first how my glory operated in human history. You need to know who I am. You need to know me, therefore you can trust me. And let me remind you, and you need to remind the Israelites what I did. You know, these two names of these two places, commentators tell us, mark the boundary between the southern part of Judah and the western part of Egypt around the region of Mount Sinai. What God is basically saying is, I want you to remember, Habakkuk, how my glory was displayed in leading these Israelites from Exodus in Egypt into the promised land, into Canaan. You've seen it. I have shown you my glory. What has happened in this journey from where they were slaves till they became freed men. And you need to remember that so that it can help you to trust me right now in whatever you're going through and whatever is going to happen. And then he goes on to describe in graphic detail, as images flashing, going back and forth in the history of how God's power and his majesty and his glory was displayed in the redemption of Israel from Egypt to Canaan. And there are multiple pictures flashing in his mind. And first, verse 4 says, his splendor covered the heavens and the earth was full of his praise. For a Hebrew Israelite Jew who was reading this would immediately connect him to the cloud that was covering them as they were in the Exodus and the pillar of fire that was provided for them from the heavens at night. God displayed his glory in sustaining and caring for them in the desert where there is nothing. And then in verse 4 it says, his brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. And this, in the context of these geographical regions, to think what happened, because for an Israelite, he knows these two places. He knows especially when he's talking of this Mount Sinai region, that's talking about the mount there, and Moses actually refers to it in his last speech in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Everybody knows what happened on Mount Sinai. They didn't get to see the brightness of God, but they couldn't even gaze into the face of Moses, who was on Mount Sinai in God's presence. His face was radiating. If the face of a man who was in the presence of God was radiating, how much more would be the radiating glory of God on Mount Sinai? No one was supposed to even touch the mountain. If even an animal touched it, was going to be destroyed. So they're remembering the glory of God in Mount Sinai. And what happened in Mount Sinai? It says, rays flashed from his hand. He was giving them the 10 commandments that were laser inscripted on these 2 tablets that Moses was going to bring him down. Remember that, Habakkuk? How did you get here? Remember where you were and where you are now and what all had to happen? How all I had to intervene in human history? What are all the extraordinary, unbelievable, unimaginable things I had to do to get these people from there to here? Remember where you are now? Remember all the things that have happened in your past? Remember all the extraordinary, glorious things I did to care for you, to bring you to be where you are now? Let me give you some more. He says, verse 5, before him went pestilence and plague followed at his heels. And who is this talking about? Even you and I can guess. It's not rocket science. He talks about the plagues of Egypt that he had to unleash to humble the mighty Pharaoh, the greatest empire that existed at that time in human history. He said, you could have been the greatest nation, but I will bring you down if I want to. I brought down the mighty nation of Egypt through my plagues, through my pestilence, which left you unharmed. And you came through. Remember that? Verse 6 says, he stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. And this is referring to all the nations they had to fight through from the Exodus till Canaan that were in the way of preventing them from going to the promised land. God had to shake those nations off from their path. And the battles that were fought on the mountains and the hills, remember them? And verse 7 says, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Now, even as the Israelites were being led through this Exodus, we know what they did. Even a slight discomfort, they began to grumble. They started building a golden calf. They couldn't wait for Moses to come back. And God had to do something to draw them back to him. And so he sent these two nations, the nation of Cushan and the nation of Midian. And even after that, these particular nations were used by God as a chastisement upon them. And we read about this after, this is not just after they went into Canaan, after they lived in Canaan, even after they were in the promised land, they would still not seek God. And he had to use some nations to remind them of who he is. But then he went after those nations and brought them low. We read about that in the book of Judges, of these two nations and what happened to them. So what basically God is telling us, hey, I love my people, I love you. But the problem is not just for me to know that I love you. You need to know that I love you so you can love me and trust me. And if you're not doing that, I have to let these other people come to give you a reset of reality. But I will also avenge you, even though I allowed the Egyptians to inflict pain, I brought the Egyptians down. It was a great nation. Even though I allowed these tiny nations of Cush and Midian to come and humble you, I avenged them too. You see, you lived, you're alive, you survived. And it goes on in verse 8 and 9, was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers? Or your indignation against the sea when you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? You stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. He's talking of splitting of rivers and sea, and we know exactly again what he's talking about. How the armies, the most powerful army and the most powerful chariots were consumed in the Red Sea. And God told them, this Egyptian whom you see today, you will never see again. He says, you saw this with your own eyes. They were not able to get the better of you. Israel as a nation survived. You survived that. Though not all, when it came to entering the promised land, the criteria for survival was faith. It was just Caleb and Joshua because they believed. You see, the central theme of the book of Habakkuk is what? The just shall live by faith. And the two people who were able to believe God through all those things, who entered the promised land, believed what God had done. They believed that the Lord has come and he is coming, and so therefore all who wait patiently and believe in him will live. And he continues to give even more images. He says, verse 10, the mountains saw you and writhed, the raging waters swept on, the deep gave forth its voice, it lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped, as the flash of your glittering spear. You marched through the earth in fury, you threshed the nations in anger. Now it's moving from the time of Moses to the time of Joshua. You remember how Joshua stopped the sun, how Joshua fought all the other armies and nations. Remember the battle of Jericho, how the wall came down. And without their effort, without doing anything, God gave them victory. It was not by the strength of their arrows, it was the light of the arrows of God, the invisible arrows that destroyed nations before their very own eyes. Trusting God in prayer, God will reveal to us what He has done in the past. That's what prayer does. You know, if we just try to survive in those times with a short 2 or 3 minute prayer, you're going to miss this. He's saying we went through challenges, but God has sustained. So our faith gets reshaped when we pray. When we spend that time, you know, the Selah is just a time of pause. There's no specific measurement. Where you go into God's presence, God actually is a prayer answering God. God actually is answering. He's telling Habakkuk, He's answering the questions he asked right at the beginning. Help them to understand. He's saying, here's how you can understand. Are you going through a painful time in your life right now, my dear friends? Have you come to the point of letting go and letting God by being in His presence, in prayer, and waiting to hear from Him? So God can reveal things to you. You know, the faith that God is wanting us to exercise in challenging times is not an empty faith, but a faith that rests in the glory of God. So that's the first thing Habakkuk gets in his understanding of this glorious God in human history. He says, you can trust me even through your most painful trials, because I have shown you, even through the most painful things in human history, how my glory was unveiled in helping you survive and taking you into the promised land and establishing you there. And because I'm a glorious God and I will do all things for my glory, I will use all the exigencies of my power and might to make it happen. You can trust me. And second, he tells them, you can trust me because I'm also revealing my glory in something I'm about to do. That's the between the times. This was in the past. There's something I'm going to do. Verse 13 says, you went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. But just first, the verse 13. Who is the anointed he is talking about? You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. He's saying in order to save not just the Israelites, but you and me and anyone, God actually came literally into this world through His Son Jesus. And it was Jesus Christ who actually bore the entire wrath of God that was due upon you and me for our faithlessness, our unfaithful life, that you and I ought to have been consumed, but God said, no, I'm not going to do it on you. I'm going to unleash it on my anointed. And not just unleashing His wrath on Christ, through His death and resurrection, Christ overcame the evil one who was Satan. He says, you crushed the head of the house of the wicked. Ultimately, the source of evil is what God is going to deal with once and for all, and which He did, the demonstration of His glory on the cross. I want you to see that. Habakkuk couldn't get this whole comprehensive vision, but you and I are in a different vantage point. We can see that. So we can look back at human history and our own personal life history to see how God has come through every single time, and we can look at the cross to see what it took for God to redeem you and me and overcome evil once and for all, that we can look at death and say, "Oh, death, where is your sting?" And doesn't just stop there. It says there's more. There's still more. Verse 14 and 15, "You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters." Satan is comprehensively defeated when Christ is going to come again to judge this world. And that's the language that is used here is very similar to the language you will see in the book of Revelations. Christ riding gloriously on this white horse with fiery eyes and bronze feet. And he's going to destroy evil once and for all. The glorious God shines forth in prayer. Is that happening in our prayer, my dear friends? And that's why the best thing to do when you go through crisis, when you go through pain and suffering, the best place to be is in the presence of God. He alone can throw away our fears. He alone can reveal His glory to us. We tend to forget how much ever we know, how many ever times we know. We tend to forget. And God says, "Look back at my glory in human history. Look at my glory that was unleashed on the cross. Look at how my glory is going to happen when I come again, the final judgment. I want you to know I am in control of human history and your history and my history, and that should calm us and help us get through the crisis." And what does this do to Habakkuk? We see finally in triumphant faith. Sorry. Verse 16 onwards. He says, "First, I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us." What's happening here? This is too much information at one time for anyone to process. He's literally overwhelmed by all of this, but the result that it is doing to him, he says he's able to accept what God is going to do. His triumphant faith starts with acceptance and believing in God and His redemptive plans for the nations and for us. You remember I said, what is our problem? Our problem is we don't believe the reason why God is allowing this pain and suffering, whether it is small or big, is actually going to do anything good. That's the problem. That's the faith problem we have. We don't trust that. We don't trust that God can actually use this to do something. Well, through all of this, when we are in prayer, God will help you to surrender and take it and believe it. Now, that's what happened to me personally. And I've shared this before too. I did go and say, "God, I want to live." And his answer was, "Why?" And my wife and I, we were praying and fasting and meditating on Psalm 23. And I said, why I need to live is, well, my daughter was 2. I need to take care of my daughter. And I want to do ministry, God. You know that. I have to help you. And he was like, "Oh, so you are going to care for your family? Oh, you are? Oh, that's so cool. And you have to do ministry to help me? That's so cool." And that's humbling, isn't it? And then it took a few days for me to get there. I said, "Oh, yeah, I understand how foolish that was, God. You are the one who will care for me. Even if I am not there, I know you will care for my wife and my daughter and children. And you don't need me for ministry. It's just a privilege you give, and it can happen. That switch happened, and actually after that I was ready to die. Happily, that change happened in prayer. Took a few days, but it did. And that's what happens. When we are in a crisis, we don't have answers. Wait till you hear, till God makes that shift in your heart. It's personal, it's deep. There's no substitute for that. And the acceptance of that is what is basically saying is, I am trusting God that whatever you're allowing now is actually going to be for my good. So Habakkuk is ready. He's ready for what's going to come. The Babylonian army is going to come, and they're going to unleash terror upon the Israelites. But triumphant faith is something that is not afraid. When it comes to this point, it makes you ready to face it. In the last three verses, one of the most beautiful verses in the whole of Bible. You can't just simply say this stuff. We know this, several of us have memorized this. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. You can't just say this stuff. This is what triumphant faith looks like. What is he talking about? He's talking about a couple of things here. There's a bunch of things he says, some of which are optional, nice to have things in life, and some of which are essential and crucial for daily survival. The fig tree, the fruit, and the olive, they represent the choicest products in the Middle East, in Mediterranean culture. But on the other hand, the grain of the fields and the flock and the cattle, they encompass the necessities of life, bread, milk, and meat. You can't live without those. The absence of these items means you don't have some nice things. There's going to be no fig cakes. There's going to be no milk. There's going to be no wine. There's not going to be anointing oil for, getting sun tanned. But there's also going to be no cereal, no vegetables, no milk, no mutton, no wool. None of these are going to be available. And that's what happens. This is not coming because there's going to be a famine in the land. It comes because of war. That's what happened in Europe after World War II. Of course, millions of people died due to war in World War II. But what happened after that was in the winter, people died because they didn't have many of these basic necessities. So when the Babylonian army is going to come, they're going to ravage the land. They're going to destroy every beast, every living thing on the face of earth at that time. And none of these are going to be there. He sees that picture, but now he's ready. And that's a triumphant faith which says, even when God does all of these things, I'm going to believe nonetheless. These are not big enough to take my joy away. My joy in life is not attached to these necessities or these commodities. My joy in life is attached to my glorious God, whom I have now come to trust and believe is doing something glorious, far more than I can understand or imagine, because he's done that in the past. And he's going to do this again. I will survive. The people of Israel will survive. And eventually, through that will come the Messiah. and his reasons. And you see this, it's sometimes missed out in the English translation. Whenever he uses the word God and Lord, he goes through a lot of different Hebrew names for God. He starts with Yahweh. You know, in the very beginning of this prayer, he calls God as Eloha. It's a very archaic, old, generic name for God. Because he feels distant from God. He's not able to get this perspective and understanding. But now, after God has revealed all this in prayer, he remembers the covenantal God. Oh, this God is a covenantal God. Says, Yahweh, you're a covenantal God, and these are your covenantal children. And I know and I trust and I believe you will not leave them. And then he uses the word Elohim for God. My God in whom I trust. Elohim talks about God who is mighty in strength. He is going to be your strength. He will give you the strength to go through this painful thing because he is Elohim. And he says, he will give me feet like the deer in high places. You know, high places or mountains are those which are very treacherous and slippery, that if you try to climb with your bare feet, you can slip and fall. In fact, just this last week, I read about this high endurance race in the Southern Alps in the nation of France, where some high endurance runners were running on high elevation, and the weather had changed and it had rained, and 4 of them slipped and fell, and one of them died, actually. So what he's basically saying is, when I'm in these very challenging times, dangerous times, when I'm lost like a deer in a headlight, I know you will give me the strength when I don't have strength, God. Therefore, I can rejoice. So this rejoicing is not an empty thing. It's rejoicing because God is my covenantal God. He has covenanted that he will not leave me or forsake me. He is my Elohim. He is my mighty God who will strengthen me no matter what I go through, whether it is cancer or death or loss of a loved one or a job or a relationship. He will give me the strength to endure and push through when I don't have strength. And then he uses the word Adonai, is the lordship. You're the Lord of my universe, and my God, I will surrender. I can accept your lordship, God. That's what it means, that faith which says, oh, even though this thing is so messed up, doesn't make sense, I'm going to trust you and submit to your lordship. This will give me joy. Not by law, but by faith. So in one line, if we were to summarize the central theme of this entire book of Habakkuk, it can be this: faith triumphs in life by the intervening power of God in all of life situations. I can believe God because I know whatever may happen, God's power is going to be unleashed and he will help me overcome. And as Paul says in Romans, that we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. And that same power is at work in you and me. So how do I receive it? How do I receive it? 3 things. Remember. Got to remember. We have to remember who it is that we worship and trust and what he has done in the past. And how do I remember? The same basic disciplines of being in his word every day. Being with a group of friends who can speak and share and bring God's word to us in our lives. Being in worship every Sunday where we can reset as we go into this week. Our mind can hear this, but by midweek it's drifted off. It's drawn into something else that's going to drown us down, so we can come back and we participate in this communion that brings our focus back to the cross. All these things help us remember, and that's why it's essential to do these things. And one of the things that he uses in this psalm is the grammatical tool of parallelism or repetition. He uses the same words twice. Even here it says, verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. It's by repeating it. We do these repetitive spiritual disciplines. And finally, they will point us to rejoicing. Jonathan Edwards, was the great preacher that God used in New England revivals, one of the earliest revivals in the United States. He preached his very first sermon when he was just 18 years old. And the title of his sermon was called Christian Happiness. And his thesis was simple. His thesis was Christians should be happy. His 3 points for why Christians should be happy was this. A, he says Christians can be happy because our bad things will turn out for our good, from Romans 8:28. B, our good things, like our adoption and our justification and our union with Christ, can never be taken away from us. And C, the best things are yet to come. Very simple. An 18-year-old Jonathan Edwards, in his very first sermon, nailed it. And that's the message of Habakkuk. And this is what Jonathan Edwards would say if you had to paraphrase his sermon. He's going to say this: if you know this, if you know your names are written in heaven, if you know your good things can never be taken away from you, therefore you may now look down upon the whole army of worldly afflictions and sufferings, and you can consider with joy that however great they are and however numerous, even though they might join all their forces against you and put on the most rueful and dreaded habits, forms, and appearances, and spend all their strength, vigor, and violence against you, they cannot do you any real hurt or mischief, and it will all be in vain. You may triumph over them all if you know these things. Amen. Let's pray.